All right, welcome back to the Blender Basics tutorials. This one is going to be a continuation of the previous video, which was about origin points. And this is going to be, first of all, about the cursor, this little circle that you see, what we can use it for, because it's very useful, and the concept of pivot points. So let's start off with talking about this cursor and kind of getting back to where we were in this video. You'll notice that the little yellow dot is kind of at its belly button. This is the origin of this model, the male model here, this guy, the origin point, which is in the geometric center of his body. All I did is I went up to the object here and I wrote set origin to geometry. And that puts it at the geometric center of the object. And if I were to just take this thing, making sure that this is a default, and rotate it, it rotates around that pole, basically. Like it's rotating around the belly button, the origin, the belly button. Now, it's all great and everything like that, but let's say that I have this guy here and I want to scale him up, make him taller. And I press S, and you'll see sort of what happens is sort of a little bit annoying. He's growing, but he's growing from that point. And so he's growing, evenly, except for that because he's growing from this point, his legs are just going right through the floor. And if you had like buildings and stuff like that, and every time you scale them up or down, they go through the floor or go up from the floor. Let's say I made them smaller. Same problem. Now he's kind of floating in space. So very often, if you have some objects that are like on a floor, you don't want that to happen. You want the bottom of the object to stay connected to the floor or touching the floor, and then it to scale from there. And that would mean that you would need to actually change the origin point of the object. And you need to change it very deliberately, choose where you want to put it and put it there. So how do you actually do that? How do you change an origin point very specifically? I didn't show you that last time. All I showed you was putting the origin at the world center or at the geometric center. So this is one of the uses of this cursor. Right now, this cursor here is kind of at the world origin. I'm going to get rid of the plane here for a second. And I'm just going to show you that, first of all, you can move around the cursor. And I'll show you why that's useful in a minute. If I go to this here, on the left here, actually, first of all, I'm going to turn my screencast keys on, just so everyone sees what's going down. Wonderful. If I go up here to the upper left, and now usually I'm on the select box, or the select, the select arrow. But if I go to here, now I can actually move this cursor to random place, random, but places where I want it. So, okay, I can put it over there. Well, let's say I want to put the cursor in specific areas. I'm going to show you that the basic menu that you use is you press Shift S and you hold it. Now I have all these different areas that I can put the cursor, all different options. If I go, whoops, I'll put that back. If I go Shift S, 1, the cursor pops back to the world origin. So no matter where it is, I'm still on the cursor. If I drag it over here, I didn't press G, by the way. I just pulled it with my left mouse and dragged it. Let's say now it's here in some weird area. If I press Shift S and I hold S and I press 1, it pops back to the world origin. That's very useful. And if I press Shift S2, it ends up popping to, in this case, the origin of this object, the selected object. Now, because the selected object was in object mode, the selected object is this guy here, it actually connected and stuck to the object origin, which was this point in this belly button. I'll undo that. I'll just put this back to the world origin. Now, I can show you what I can do. If I can select where this thing goes exactly. So remember that the idea that if I want to grow this thing and have him stay on the floor and not have his legs go through the floor, what I would actually need to do is I need to put the origin point right between his feet on the floor. And then he'll grow up from there and not shrink through and not grow down through the floor. He'll only grow this way. Okay, so how do I do that? Go into edit mode and select, in this case, I want it to be right in the middle. I'm going to select two faces, or it could be vertices, but faces are easy, where if the cursor tries to go to these two faces, it's actually going to go right in the middle of the two. And I selected these two faces that are at ground level. See? So now what happens, if I zoom out a little bit, if I press Shift S2, it actually pops in between exactly those two faces, and it's actually at a good position. If the origin point was down here, as you're going to see in a second, I'll be able to scale this up, and this feet will stay on the floor because it's going to grow from that point. All right, so now all I have is the cursor there, but the origin point's still there. How do I get this to follow where the cursor is? It's pretty easy. Press Tab, go into Object Mode, go into the Object panel, I guess you could say, set Origin. Before went Origin to Geometry, which is why it's in the middle of the geometry. But if I go Origin to 3D Cursor, bloop, it pops down to the 3D cursor. So I could put that origin wherever I want it to go. Now that it's there, the object origin is no longer in the middle of its body, it's actually on the floor because I can put it wherever I want. Now look what happens when I scale this guy. Hey, he scales, but his feet stay basically in the same position. He doesn't go through the floor. Imagine you had a building. That would mean if you wanted the building to be bigger, you just scaled it up and it wouldn't just penetrate through the floor, and you would have the scaling would be kind of logical for what you would want. But the whole point was I could move the origin point of this object to wherever I want by basically positioning it using the cursor. I'll do another kind of example of that. Let's say I wanted the origin to be, I don't know, at the neck. So what I could do is I could just go to face mode here and select this ring of faces and do the same thing I did before. Shift S2. And now the origin pops to that area. Sorry, the cursor pops to that area. Now I can do what I did before. Go out to Object Mode. Go to Object, Set Origin to 3D Cursor. And now that little yellow dot is now where the cursor is. So basically what you're doing is you're selecting faces on the model, snapping the cursor to those faces, and then going and putting the origin point to the cursor. So it's a little bit of a three-step process, but it's still pretty fast. And you're going to see where I'm going to use it for later for other things. So that's one use of this cursor, is to basically reset origin points very strategically. Put this thing back to the middle. All right. Well, we're going to get back to the cursor in a second, but first I want to show you now a little bit about the idea of pivot points. What is a pivot point? A pivot point is pretty much what it sounds like. If I rotate something, it's the point where it's rotating around, the stick where it's rotating around. So right now, let's look at this guy here. This guy here, the origin point is in the middle of its neck, right? And this menu here that I just opened up, which we haven't looked at before, look up here, about in the middle, and it's the Transform Pivot Point menu. By default, objects will pivot around their origin. So right now, if I rotate this guy, let's say I do, I'm looking at it from the front, it's going to rotate around that yellow dot. Right? And now wherever I put that yellow dot, if it stays at individual origins, that's where it's going to rotate around. So if I go over here and I do sort of do what I did before, let's say I do, maybe not that, here, and then I do Shift S2, and then I go back into Object Mode, Origin to 3D Cursor. All right, now I rotate it, and it rotates around that dot. So basically, rotating around individual origins, or having the origin as its pivot point, allows you to rotate it around the dot. That's one option. Now, I could also choose pivot around the 3D cursor. Now the 3D cursor is right in the world origin, and now look what happens when I rotate this guy. He's rotating around the cursor. And actually, if I move wherever I move the cursor, since I'm still in cursor mode, I move it to here, and now it rotates around there. So it's basically using the cursor as a pivot point, because that's what this selection is. So I selected 3D cursor, and that's why it's pivoting around the 3D cursor. If I just go back to individual origins, it'll rotate around this, which is kind of in its crotch here. And so it depends what you're doing. Sometimes you want to rotate around the origin, sometimes you want to rotate around the cursor. You just have a lot of options which you use. For the next one, I'm going to first of all duplicate this guy. Let me actually show you another cool trick with the cursor. Okay, I want to get this cursor to go at the world origin. Hopefully you remember how I do that. Shift S1, and now it pops to the center. Now, if I want any object to actually snap to the cursor, I can take this object. Of course, I could just move it physically, but I could also take this object and have it snap to the cursor. To do that, I go Shift S as always, and I go 8. And now it snaps to the cursor. And of course, it snaps in its origin point. Since the origin was the crotch, it snaps there at its crotch level. So, okay, let's just take this guy here. We have this guy now in the world origin. If I duplicate it a couple times, make 3 of them. There we go, a little holy trinity of guys. Okay, let's select multiple objects. Oops, let me put that back. Let's select multiple objects. This, holding Shift, this, and this. So I've now selected all 3. And we're going to see that when you select multiple objects, there's a couple of other options you can pivot around. So right now, it's set at individual origins. So each of these 3 objects are going to pivot around their own origin. And remember, their own origin point is this little dot between their crotch. So I press R right now, they're all going to spin around their own little origins. Whee! Like that. It's very fun. Let's say I go and I say, no, actually I want them to rotate around the 3D cursor. They're all going to rotate around that point. Let's do it. And now they all rotate around that point. Let's look at the difference. 3 of them rotating around the 3D cursor. 3 of them rotating around their own origins. It's obviously a completely different effect. By the way, I keep pressing Control Z to just undo what I just did. There's another option when you have multiple objects selected. You can go to the median point. The median point is some kind of a midpoint between all 3 of these objects, and it's decided by, the computer decides where it is. So let's see where it is. It's now that point right there. This computer has calculated that the midpoint of these 3 objects is right under this guy's pecs. So now it's rotating around that. And so it just really depends what you're doing. And you're going to see in future videos when I do stuff, I'm going to be switching between these different pivot points depending on what I need to actually do. One more quick demo. Go here, I'll get rid of this guy. And I'm going to show you sort of another use of both the pivot points and moving around this cursor. So let's, it doesn't really matter where this guy goes. Just really move him up a little bit. Doesn't matter. Okay, so let's say that I'm actually posing this character. And you're going to see where we can use the shifting cursor thing. Okay, let's say I want to rotate his head left and right, or just left. So if I go to edit mode, first I want to decide, so I want this guy's head to rotate to the left. And which means I'm not going to just like take it and grab it and just rotate. Obviously I want to do this in some kind of a controlled way, not just like, you know, sort of randomly rotate stuff. The easiest way to do that is to, first of all, say, okay, let's say I want the head to rotate. Where does it actually rotate from? So a head, really in real life, rotates pretty much from here, the base of where the vertebrae connects into the skull. That's the main area where the head's going to rotate. So what I might say is, okay, well, let me put my pivot point, maybe one lower down. Let me put my pivot point somewhere in the middle of this kind of circle area. So to do that, I select where I want the pivot point to come, and I do what I did before. Shift S2, and the cursor, my friend the cursor, snaps to the inside, to the sort of the average point inside that loop. Now, you might wonder, why am I doing all of this? Well, now that the cursor is there, and I switch my pivot point to the 3D cursor, this is now the axis of rotation. This is the area where it rotates around. And before this video, I actually made a vertex group for the head. There it is. Maybe I'll remove this row of faces. So now what happens is if I rotate this, it rotates around that pivot point. Exactly. I've decided where I want it to rotate from, and that's where it's rotating from. And of course, I'm rotating it now that way. I could rotate it Z. Well, I rotated it quite a lot there. Let me zoom out a little bit, because when you rotate something, I'll rotate Z. I'm really rotating it all the way around. But it's rotating directly from that pivot point. Of course, it looks super weird because it's, let me put the proportional editing a little bit larger. That's a bit better. It's rotating around that area. So this is super useful for things like posing and stuff like that, because you can choose exactly where you want the thing to rotate within the actual mesh. doesn't have, the whole thing doesn't have to rotate. You can choose parts of the mesh and say, that's where I want the thing to rotate from. So this could be done to pose the arms and the forearms and the head and legs and whatever. Basically figuring out where you want it to rotate from and setting the cursor to that position and then rotating it, the pivot point being the 3D cursor. So hopefully this has given you just some basic overview of this concept of pivot points and the use of the cursor, and we're going to get to it in future videos. We're going to use this. Okay, thank you very much.